last speaker today is Dr. Mark Hellman. Yeah, okay, great. As Director of Aquatic Technology for SePRO, Dr. Hellman leads the company's research and development to bring forward new technologies for managing water resources. He has characterized diverse management technologies, including biopesticide concepts for aquatic plant and invasive mussel control, and multiple new U.S. EPA approved aquatic herbicides, including the new selective control technologies, Procelicor. You guys can tell I'm not actually an aquatics person, probably, by how I don't know any of these words. So please help me in welcoming Dr. Hellman.
Thanks, everyone. Appreciate the introduction and the opportunity to speak. My goal is to talk about one of my least favorite plants, Hydrilla. And I thought I'd also add a few comments about what's going on nationally with Hydrilla, as well as some other plants in the same family. This is not just about Hydrilla, actually. Our challenges with the family Hydrocharitaceae. Little quiz for later. The only one who probably appreciates it's Rhynthum. Phylogeny or family tree of the Hydrocharitaceae family, in which Hydrilla is the major problem plant that we face, considered the world's worst aquatic weed, basically. But there's other members of this family that are also significant invaders here in North America. Agaria is a fairly well-known one out west here, and then we have several others that are less known. LED is actually mostly considered native in the United States, but it is invasive in Alaska. I want to talk a little bit about that. There's new genetics and information about Vallisneria and non-native specimens and types of Vallisneria or tape grass here in the United States, and it's an emerging issue. And then another very interesting plant is water soldier. So talk a little bit about that one as well. I gave a version of this talk at North American Lake Management Society a few months ago, and it brought in the art of war, because a lot of our issues with invasive species almost feel like an endless war, and kind of resonating some of the comments that Dr. Madsen made in his keynote. It's a challenge. It requires persistence and a continuous commitment to contain and in some cases eradicate the species. Prevention. Sun Tzu, the famous Chinese philosopher, says that it's better not to fight at all. The supreme art of war is to do the enemy without fighting. So prevention strategies are really designed to do that. Rapid response. Certainly we need to be fast when we find a new invader, like what ISDA just did with invasive mussels. Pretty impressive. Move as swift as wind, attack like fire. When you move, fall like a thunderbolt. Pretty fun language anyway. And then management. Know your enemy. This was something that Dr. Madsen highlighted. You need to know the species that you're dealing with, its phenology, how it behaves in the environment, and that gives you the ability to implement sound management. Know your enemy, know yourself, know your strengths and weaknesses as managers. That always helps. You kind of know where your resource limits are, and then if you know those things, you can do well. Military capacity and not interfered with by the sovereign, which is an interesting one. The military capacity, obviously you need the resources to do the job of dealing with invasive species, but interfered by the sovereign is an interesting one. I liken it to just regulatory, bureaucracy, just processes that aren't really designed to help us manage invasive species. I think that's kind of what I take away from that statement. And then no instance of a country having benefited from prolonged warfare. So if we get into sustained maintenance control, we may obviously can protect some resources, but it's not really the first choice. We'd like to deal with it earlier rather than being in an endless battle against an invasive species. But let me switch gears to the individual species. So focus on my talks, Hydrilla, public enemy number one, considered the perfect aquatic weed. Worthy adversary, has a lot of strengths as an invasive plant. Adaptable disturbance specialist, certainly can survive and do well in a lot of different aquatic habitats. Grows very, very well, very rapidly under ideal conditions, and can dominate a habitat, as my title slide showed. Easy spread, vegetative fragmentation is the common route of spread of hydrilla. And it also produces above ground turions, which are end of season resting stages for growth in following spring. However, what really distinguishes hydrilla, and actually from probably all the other Hydrocharitaceae plants, is the subterranean turions of tubers. These are dormant propagules that can survive probably as long as 10 years. And that's really the source of the long-term, expensive and sustained battles that we have with hydrilla management. No successful selective biocontrols, at least to date. There's been a lot of search over the years for that biocontrol insect and or similar that will do a great job, but we don't have that. This is a plant that's very difficult to physically remove and mechanically harvest. It fragments, spreads via fragmentation, etc. So hard to deal with there. And then it's tolerant actually to some of our common, more selective aquatic herbicides. Things like 2,4-D and triclopyr it doesn't respond to. So that limits some of the toolbox we have. Just a real fast history of hydrilla's establishment in the United States, first found in Florida in the 50s, spread through the southeast United States. In 1990, after introduction of the Potomac River earlier, it began to spread out different biotype into other parts of the United States, and then made a jump somehow over to California and the West Coast. And we see spread of hydrillas continued over the last several decades. We have seen some isolated infestations here in the West, in Washington State, and also in Idaho. And then we have a kind of a line that a lot of agencies are fighting, trying to keep hydrilla out of the Great Lakes. And I won't get into all the details. If anyone has any interest in any particular aspect of anything I talk about, I can talk offline with you if you want. But hydrilla's weaknesses, and these in quotes, because it's a tough plant. It's really, and I think Dr. Madsen again said it, it's finding these phenological weak points within the invasive plant's growth cycle. And in this case for hydrilla, it's after tuber germination and then before new tuber formation. That's ideally where we want to manage. We can do that in a couple different ways. We can deal with the plant. If it's monoecious hydrilla, we can commonly do sonar aquatic herbicide treatments or fluoridone that can actually shut down tuber germination shortly after it occurs. Plants never get big, more of a pre-emergent type use pattern. And then after the fact, later in the season, if we detect a population, if we can just get ahead of that tuber production, we can obviously get more traction over the long term. Another weakness per se is senescence. The monoecious, the classical monoecious type of hydrilla does senesce in the north completely every season. So we have died back generally by late in the year, and then through the first few months of the winter, there's no hydrilla. Then you have new tubers germinating, and the cycle starts again. But there's only so much energy in those tubers and turions, so that's a weak point for the plant in terms of its growth cycle. Dioecious hydrilla in the south does persist, more perennial through the year. Does over the winter in the south part of the U.S. and southeast in particular, it will overwinter and survive from year to year, and that represents another set of challenges for man. It does compete well, but I will say places where I've seen it introduced, it seems to find a niche in very shallow water, high energy water, disturbed areas where other submerged plants aren't as productive in terms of establishment. That seems to be where we find hydrilla first. So that gives us at least an opportunity for a place to look for new infestations of the plant. And I'll point out, this is an example of this. Niagara River has a new infestation, and it's also in that shallow water zone around those docks. So state of the war, we have warming climate, we have eutrophication. A lot of things are promoting an expanded growth range for some of our plants that are more warm water loving, longer growing seasons. A lot of things are favoring hydrilla and its expansion to the north. However, we have had some success over the years where the opportunities present itself to stop spread. And as I mentioned, the Great Lakes, that's really a focus now. But some partners in this room have been involved with some of these projects, like in Washington or California's ongoing emergency, as John mentioned earlier. Pipe and Lucerne Lakes in Washington is a successful eradication effort begun in the 90s through the most of the 2000s. And there's several locations in Idaho. I don't know the exact status of those, but those are under consistent management. Mantau in Indiana, a few other sites I won't get into in detail, but there are examples of eradication success. However, unfortunately, hydrilla continues to be a national problem. I would say more anecdotal observations in synthesizing things that I've seen is that Florida and several of the southeastern states are probably dealing with some of the worst hydrilla pressure they've seen in a while. There are persistent populations in large systems in the northeastern U.S., and some of these have already been under management to try to contain or eradicate for 10 years or more. There are detections of the plant in the Niagara River, a few other new sites in the northeast, and then the first finds in Michigan in small ponds. So it is spreading still, so there's always that warning, and then a new genetic new threat on the field of battle, so to speak, is the Connecticut River hydrilla, which has been referenced as clade C based on some different taxonomic schemes, and there's a new paper that actually describes it as a new subspecies. This hydrilla is unique in the United States compared to the other two forms, dioecious in the southeastern U.S., and monoecious has been more mid-Atlantic and northern U.S. So what does the future war look like, the art of war on hydrilla? Well, we need to do whatever we can to enhance containment and remove new infestations, current ones and new ones. I think prevention, I'll beat the drum pretty hard on prevention because I've seen it too many times lately of hydrilla on the move from public sites into other water bodies. Enhanced detection monitoring, whack the elephant, not the mole. I'll get into that in a second. Eradication versus forever maintenance control or no management. I think that's an important distinction in your management planning and goals. You need to decide just how far you'll take eradication, because not doing it with hydrilla is a very expensive choice, because lakes will be eaten up with it with a very high maintenance cost. So prevention, public ramps, just some photos of things that I've seen. Boat in Florida with hydrilla on it. Connecticut River hydrilla, just a ramp there with a lot of hydrilla that's scattered on it. Anything we can do, Dr. Madsen talked about some of the federal regulations around spread of noxious weeds. Even though this sounds sort of doom and gloom, hydrilla overall is not in very many water bodies across the United States. So you can decide where you are in the invasion curve with hydrilla, but there's still many water bodies to protect, watersheds to protect. And anything we can do to stop this from happening in public ramps, we should certainly take those steps. Detection and monitoring, we have seen the use of eDNA now for certain invasive aquatic plants, including hydrilla. We've seen the use of diving where the water quality is permissible, and also underwater photography. Even drones now are being looked at to detect early stage infestations of hydrilla. Aerial drones can be used for the shallow water finds potentially, so I would encourage looking at that as a possible detection strategy. And then when we get into management, I make the analogy of whack the elephant versus the mole, and that comes down to when you see early infestations of hydrilla, you find patches out there, and whacking the mole has kind of been the descriptor of that kind of hunt and peck management. And I think you want to be targeted in your management. You certainly don't want to treat areas unnecessarily where you don't know for sure that you have hydrilla, but hydrilla is not very forgiving if you miss it. So it's better to have a large footprint for that spot management as much as you can. So the management actions, excuse me, be large, encompass all your known or even theoretically possible areas, or at least high probable areas of hydrilla infestation. Be longer in duration of management, meaning there's that window of phenological weak point for the hydrilla maximize that. Don't let the plant get out of that phase. Don't let it try to regrow late in the season, for example. Keep the pressure on. Make sure there's no new tuber formation. Make sure all germinating tubers are treated. It's a very thorough style of management that's necessary to deal with hydrilla. Multiple seasons consecutively. Obviously, that's the path to eradication, is we want to get rid of the tuber bank that's in the sediment, which can be thousands per square meter. You need to wear that down. Hydrilla is germinating a certain fraction of tubers in a given spring, or for dioecious over a consistent period during the year. You need to wear that down. You need to do it consistently to get to what would be a maintenance control level. If you take a year off, 1 year on, 1 year off, you don't make much headway against hydrilla. Eradication. California's eradication efforts are the most successful, and they have an ongoing state of emergency that supports that. And that's really the driver, is that there's a very high bar that they want to achieve with eradicating and containing sites. I've already mentioned hydrilla is not present in much of the U.S. Eradication should remain the first goal as new infestations are found. And part of this is that hydrilla is just hard to manage. It's probably several times more expensive to manage hydrilla than any of our other submerged invasive aquatic plants. So that's another rationale for being very aggressive with the management goal. We have improved hydrilla management overall and eradication efforts through collaborative R&D, collaborations with the Corps of Engineers Aquatic Plant Control Research Program, a lot of state researchers and universities, and then private partners all have worked together to refine what we can do on hydrilla. So that puts us in a better place. It's still a hard battle. Just some quick examples of dealing. We have successfully eradicated hydrilla out of small river systems, different sites. That does at least inform the same principles for larger riverine system management. Lake systems, I've already mentioned Pipe and Lucerne. A couple examples. Lake Waccamaw, North Carolina, is a pretty large lake, almost 9,000 acres, where hydrilla was eradicated out about 5-6 years ago as far as the last finds. Lake Manitou in Indiana was one that was pretty risky to be spreading hydrilla further up into the Great Lakes region, so Indiana DNR went through a process over 10 years to eradicate hydrilla out of that lake. So again, this informs what might be done in the future on hydrilla. And happy to have discussions for the rest of the conference on any specific question you have on hydrilla. And there are a number of folks who have dealt with hydrilla specifically as managers or research scientists in the room, so take advantage of their expertise. A few other problem species, just some quick highlights. Agaria, Elodie in Alaska, water soldier, and Valsinaria are the non-native tape grass. Agaria is problematic, distribution map, similar to hydrilla in terms of taxonomy or just visual look, but generally more leaflets, smoother leaves, no serrations, etc. You can see the distribution on the west coast, and the most problematic infestation in the United States of Agaria is in the California, Sacramento, San Joaquin River Delta, where the delta is a huge interface of a lot of different things going on. Major agricultural area, so irrigation use, ecologically critical in California and the Western U.S. at large. Recreational use, and it's also critical habitat for a variety of threatened species. And Agaria was initially introduced in the 1950s, and it infests as much as 20% of the delta. So a pretty large footprint. And I just showed the Agaria photo from Walmart.com. You can still buy Agaria at Walmart.com in case anyone needs it. So in 1996, the Cal Parks Division of Boating and Waterways was formed. Its Agaria control program was formed. A lot of work by a lot of scientists to go through risk assessments and characterize different management strategies for Agaria. And that led to the first operational management in the mid-2000s. Probably we'll call it the poster child of agaricide management out there, is in Frank's track. There's been some published work on the reductions of agaricide in Frank's track and how that's been done selectively. The paper Dr. Madsen is a co-author on, just showing the reductions, not so much in agaricide presence, so it's not reflected exactly in this table, but really jumps out as the presence of native aquatic plants after management in Frank's track that helped basically get down agaricide to that maintenance control level and promote native aquatic plant response. So it can be done on some of these species, sustainable selective maintenance control. Elodea, again, not invasive in most of the U.S., but in Alaska, and then I found out Puerto Rico apparently has a finding as well. But Alaska, it is non-native and invasive in Alaska, and floatplains are the ones, the vector of spread of this species up in that part of the world. Very dense growth, and it's interfering. And there's actually been some recently published studies with multiple year studies looking at the effects of Elodea on food web energetics, et cetera, and in this case, Chinook salmon, and really documenting that there's an energetic shift away from salmon and their productivity, growth, and success in the presence of Elodea. And this is obviously very important. Salmon and other fish species up there critical. So starting back in the mid 2010s, there was the effort to eradicate Elodea out of a variety of sites in Alaska, and that is ongoing. There's been success in some areas, but they're still chasing Elodea and its presence in the state. Water soldier, very nasty plant, probably the nastiest aquatic plant that I've seen. If anyone's dealt with water hyacinth, this is kind of a plant that can grow. It's rooted, but it's in shallow water, can emerge out of the water surface with an emergent growth form. It can grow both submerged or emergent. You can see the growth form picture. The real highlight is those leaf margins are very severely serrated. Very sharp spines, absolutely will cut you if you rub them the wrong way. So imagine acres and acres of this plant overtaking a site. Habitat value is basically zero. Just a couple pictures of the plant. It again grows in a more of a rosette, almost like a spider or air plant kind of growth form, but with roots going down to the bottom, and it can go up and down the water column seasonally. It also does produce turions, which you can see the photo in the right, in the axils in the rosette of the growing plant at the end of the season. So there's another reproductive, long-term reproductive strategy for this plant. Thankfully only found in Ontario right now, a variety of small ponds, and then unfortunately a pretty significant river systems infested that is run down into what is technically now Lake Ontario. So it is in the Great Lakes system. We can expect some movement. And here's a little close-up of that watershed, the Trent River, moving down into Bay of Quinte, and then the northern part of Lake Ontario. So this is a plant on the move, and relative to national interests in the western U.S., for example, the reds and oranges are definitely considered climatically favorable for water soldier. So certainly it's possible that a plant like this could move out west and be a problem. Again, this is a pond about 7 feet deep with the plant, so pretty nasty. We can manage it. We've done some research treatment on it. Diquat is quite effective on it. Priscillochlor happens to be, and is registered in Canada. So anyway, managers are trying to figure out what to do with that one up there, but it is a nasty, nasty problem. I hope you never run across that plant. And then finally, exotic Vallisneria, as I'll call it, is a very interesting one. We presume that we've mostly had Vallisneria americana, tape grass, water celery, common names, and that's been sort of universal. But there's been a lot of differences in morphology associated with the plant growth form, and sort of some head scratching about what that means. Well, that like Dr. Thum would say, that's genetic diversity at work, and sure enough, we're seeing the evidence of non-native genetics within Vallisneria Some of it's pure, I would say, genetically distinct species, such as Vallisneria australis in parts of the California Delta. Others is actually a hybridization, and it may have come out of the aquaculture or aquarium plant trade, where someone's bred a particularly vigorous and healthy form of Vallisneria, and then unfortunately it's escaped out of that environment into the real world and posed issues. And we see it scattered in the southeast U.S. We see some new genetics on some of these populations. And Lake Guntersville, that part of the world, in the Tennessee Valley Authority reservoir system, we're seeing expansion of this, one of these exotic val types. And that gentleman's dealing with a mess load of slough leaves from one of those. So it's an emerging issue. It's one to kind of keep in mind. If you have Vallisneria in any of your systems, and also it just shows up and maybe was a minor part of the community, and all of a sudden it's growing at nuisance levels and behaving very differently, you might want to look into that. Send it to Dr. Thune, others who can kind of characterize that better so you know what you're dealing with. So to conclude, this is one of my favorite hydrilla photos. I happened to catch a crane behind a rake throw. It's a heavy lift. Hydrilla and some of these species in this family are hard to deal with. And it's an ongoing battle, no doubt about it. We need to be good, very proactive in advocating for resources. I think one of the major things to do is keep our stories out there about successful management and the threats of these species. Keep it in front of decision makers and just keep doing it because it will have return. We're protecting a lot of water. Get things out of the way, as I said before. Don't be interfered with by processes that aren't good as far as invasive species management. You got to work through them, but as much as possible, work through them in advance of finding a new invasive. And then ultimately, control and eradication certainly is feasible. We have successful examples of both good sustained maintenance control and eradication of some of these species. And I think part of that reinforcement to decision makers is we're protecting literally billions of dollars of economic activity. I think we underestimate how much economic value around lakes and different waterways that we are protecting by managing invasive aquatic plants. Lake Manitou, the Indiana eradication, $280 million on this 800-acre lake, $280 million of property value just around this one lake. If hydrilla and some of these invasive plants impact that by 10 or 20%, we're talking tens of millions of dollars of economic value that's been impaired. So those are simple examples to highlight there's a lot of economic value, and that's in addition to the ecological return on protecting our water resources. So with that, I'm not sure I have too much time, but maybe a few minutes.
You might have said this, but for Hydrilla, is it, what do you treat it with?
Well, hydrilla can be managed in a few different ways using systemic or contact herbicides. Diquat, chelated copper, endothol, those are good kind of knockdown, contact-like treatments for hydrilla. Then we have systemic herbicides. The most commonly has been used over time is fluridone or sonar aquatic herbicide. We have several other herbicides that have activity as well, systemic herbicides. The new herbicide Priscillacor, as Terry said, very good on milfoil, but also happens to have pretty good activity on hydrilla and a very selective activity as well on hydrilla. There are tools in the toolbox. We could always use more tools. Again, if successful biocontrol would be phenomenal to weave into the process, just haven't gotten there.
Are there any estimates that you use with the chemicals that seem to make any big difference?
For submerged treatments, I wouldn't say really. There are some instances of combinations, like for example, diquat and copper are a fairly common combination treatment to get additivity and efficacy on hydrilla. But as far as in-water surfactants, there's a few things that might have some in-water activity in terms of improving uptake, but I wouldn't say they're, as far as hydrilla management, for example, that they're well documented in terms of impact. Any other questions? Yep.
Testing on like what herbicides and how the best efficacy on the Ballston area that are like common.
Vallisneria. Well, again, some of our contact herbicides, depending on water quality, can have some activity on, beyond just copper, can have some activity on Val. The issue becomes regrowth potential there, is that the rhizome, particularly some of these kind of novel Vallisneria types, have vigorous root systems, a lot of below ground energy. Val in general has that, but some of these seem to have that on steroids, and so their recovery potential is really high. So if you don't get a thorough control, you could be really fighting it. So I think ultimately weaving in some systemic principles, whether sonar pellets or some other systemic activity that's effective on the Val, slows it down in conjunction with the contact program is probably the best way to try to wear down established Val. Okay. Yep.